Welcome to The Koi Farmer, where we focus on cultivating clarity in the complicated world of pharmacy benefits. I'm Justine. I'm a pharmacist with 20 years of experience in the business of pharmacy. And today, in our Drug Pricing Index series, we're going to be breaking down the concept of Wholesale Acquisition Cost, or WAC. This drug pricing index is commonly used for two different purposes. Number one, to be able to calculate manufacturer rebates due to PBMs or plan sponsors. And number two, for pharmacies that are purchasing branded products from wholesalers or drug manufacturers. Let's dive in.
You're looking for the cure, but you're stuck in the weeds, bringing you insights into pharmacy.
Today we'll kick off with some of the basics of WAC. We'll break down the acronym, we'll talk about some parallel concepts in the industry, how it works, then we'll talk about how WAC is used in practice. What are some pros and cons of this drug pricing index? Finally, we'll be looking at the fine print of WAC. We'll talk about what happens when WAC increases. We'll talk about some scenarios where WAC has decreased over the last few years and how PBMs and plan sponsors are impacted by that. And then lastly, we'll talk about how some of the pharmaceutical manufacturers are deploying dual NDC strategies in the marketplace related to WAC and AWP setting. Let's dive in. So first, let's talk about the acronym. WAC stands for Wholesale Acquisition Cost. In brand drugs, wholesale acquisition cost can be similar to the actual cost that pharmacies purchase drugs for. However, for generic drugs, that's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily connected to wholesale pricing. It's not necessarily tied to acquisition. And again, similar to AWP, it's highly rarely the cost that any players in the drug value chain actually pay for the product. The wholesale acquisition cost has somewhat of a sister index utilized commonly in the industry, and this is the AWP, or average wholesale price. While not universally true, typically the WAC times about 1.2 will generally be where the manufacturers set the AWP. Now we're going to talk through how WAC actually gets established and distributed in the market. So the first step is that the manufacturer is setting the product pricing strategy and attaching a WAC to a product when it launches. At launch, the manufacturers report the pricing that they have chosen into proprietary compendia sources. This typically includes First Data Bank or Medispan, which are subscription services that most of the industry players subscribe to. Given the publishing through proprietary sources, the patient is generally unaware of the drug's WAC and unable to find this information. At the pharmacy, brands and generics may behave a little bit differently as it relates to WAC. For brands, the patient may be likely to pay close to WAC, potentially a little bit more than WAC, and for generics, the patient is typically going to pay significantly less than the WAC for a particular product. Then lastly, as plan sponsors or PBMs negotiate rebates from manufacturers, typically those rebates are contracted on the basis of WAC. So as the WAC changes, those rebates payable may change along with them. So now we've covered some of the basics of how WAC is created and distributed through the industry. Next, we're going to talk about some examples of how WAC is used in contracting practices in the industry and some pros and cons of this index. Wholesale acquisition cost is often the basis for most PBM rebate contracts and also the basis for pharmacies purchasing branded drugs from wholesalers or manufacturers. I have an oversimplified example of how each of these contracts might be structured on the right side of this slide. As it relates to rebates are typically negotiated as a percentage of WAC. So for example, WAC times 30% would equal the rebate for a particular product that a drug manufacturer would owe a PBM upon invoicing. In addition to this, pharmacies commonly contract brand drugs from wholesalers or directly from drug manufacturers at a WAC minus a certain percent. So in this example, I've offered that it could be WAC minus 3.5% would be the price that the pharmacy would pay the wholesaler for branded products. Delving a little bit deeper into how rebate contracts are structured in the industry, I have, again, an oversimplified example, but something that I think could help conceptualize how rebates are typically contracted for. So this is one example. WAC times 30% is the rebate. Again, the range could be anywhere from WAC times 3% all the way up to WAC times 60%. It certainly depends a lot on the way that the drug is positioned in the marketplace. There's also often an element of price protection in these contracts. So the PBM or plan sponsor might say in the contract, if the WAC increases greater than somewhere in the 5 to 9% range in a calendar year, then all incremental price increases should be refunded as rebate. So this can protect the PBMs or plan sponsors from sudden hikes in WAC. So what makes WAC sticky as a drug pricing index? First off, like AWP, it's a comprehensive index. Typically, Medispan and First Data Bank have a WAC published for every national drug code or NDC that is available. Secondly, it's relatively predictable for long-term modeling. Although increasing to some degree year over year, it typically increases in a relatively predictable pattern. Lastly, transitioning away from WAC would require rebate renegotiation and potentially would also require pharmacies to renegotiate their contracts with wholesalers or manufacturers. What makes WAC tricky? Again, the pricing here is set by the manufacturer. It's not necessarily overseen by any regulatory body, and changes in WAC can impact member payments because of the association between WAC and AWP. So now we've reviewed some of the basics of WAC, but let's get into some of the fine print. What happens when WAC goes up? What happens when it suddenly goes down? And how are manufacturers strategizing to potentially create different strategies for the same product in the marketplace to deal with some different political environments that have come up over the past several years? Now we're going to review an example of what happens to the PBM when the WAC increases. So in the base case, the manufacturer in this example would owe the PBM $180 rebate, which is WAC $600 times 30% equals the $180 paid to the PBM. There are several different structures that plan sponsors and PBMs contract with one another to be able to determine what rebate is payable. Some of these structures include a complete pass-through of rebates. Some of them include retaining a percentage of rebates. Some of them may include the PBM paying the plan sponsor a flat per brand rebate amount and making that the total payable. In this example, for ease of use, we'll be using the flat payable amount. So in this case, in the base case where the WAC equals $600, the PBM may retain $5 per script of brand rebate. So what happens when the WAC increases significantly in year? So goes from $600 to $672. So in this example, the rebate that gets paid is calculated based on WAC times 30% and also includes an additional amount because the inflation is over the 9% cap in the price protection clause in the contract. In the case of the plan sponsor, again, their contract is not necessarily tied to WAC and is tied to a per script amount. So in this case, the PBM is gaining more from the manufacturer, but has not increased their payable to the plan sponsor. So in this case where the WAC increases, the PBM may be able to retain additional rebate on this particular product. Next, we're going to cover the flip side. So long ago, it was very typical that WAC would continue to increase year over year. Typically, manufacturers put in WAC increases on the first of the year and sometime in July. And so the pattern may go as outlined on this slide. However, there have been some recent trends where some manufacturers have determined that they want to go another way. They're getting a lot of pressure from regulators and the court of public opinion that rebates or the gross to net bubble are not favorable for consumers. And so they've come out with some strategies where potentially they decrease the WAC. So in this example, the WAC was $600 with a $180 rebate on 1/1, and then on 7/1, they suddenly changed the WAC to decrease it significantly and abolish the rebate. So in this example, again, we're reviewing the base case for what happens to the PBM. So originally they were getting $180 rebate paid to them. The original rebate was WAC times 30%. They were paying the plan sponsor $175 flat guarantee. Again, these slides show a significant oversimplification of what a PBM contract looks like to make it easier to learn about this complicated industry. I've added an example clause that is typically found in contracts between plan sponsors and PBMs that cover circumstances such as WAC decreases that may make different options available for the PBM in cases of unanticipated industry changes. So in this case, When the WAC decreases to $420 and the manufacturer abolishes the rebate availability to PBMs, the rebate paid to the PBM will be $0. In this case, they would still potentially owe the plan sponsors the $175 per brand without some additional action. If they continue at this rate, they can expect that they would lose $175 per brand script that's filled by each member of the plan sponsor. I've worked at several different PBMs in times when this has happened, and really there is a significant choice that needs to be made when these industry changes come about. So the first option could be that the impact is minimal enough that the PBM is able to use retained or rebate overperformance to offset losses to be able to not have to impact the plan sponsor's projected rebates for the year. In other examples, they may need to trigger the material change clause to remove from the count of claims where the rebate is due to the plan sponsor. In this case, they would typically notify the plan sponsor of this contract change and of a specific date that this contractual update would be available. In some cases, written email notification is enough. In other cases, contracts need to be renegotiated and updated and amended. So in these first two examples, we're talking about an individual NDC where the WAC goes up or the WAC suddenly goes down. But there's a little bit of a new strategy that's emerged over the last few years, especially in specialty drugs, where the manufacturers are employing a different strategy. So initially, the manufacturers, again, would release one NDC. The PBM would have that one NDC on formulary, and the regulatory bodies would ask, why are drug list prices so high? In this case, the PBMs can easily respond, manufacturers set AWP and WAC, we have no control. Some manufacturers are taking a different stance and releasing two separate NDCs of the same product, but those products have a different AWP and WAC attached to them. This means now that the PBM has a choice amongst which of these two products they will place on formulary. And in many cases, they are still choosing the higher AWP, the higher WAC product. In this case, the regulatory bodies continue to ask, why are drug list prices so high? And for manufacturers that have deployed this strategy, they've had a new tactic to be able to take in the market, where they can say, I have supplied two different options. This option that has a higher WAC or AWP continues to be the choice that the PBMs have taken. Now the manufacturers have a new talk track. Ask the PBMs. They have supplied two different NDCs in the marketplace to be able to appease different stakeholders. And really the PBM and subsequently the plan sponsors are able to make some different decisions among which products they will carry and cover. In early 2026, the FTC reached a settlement with a major PBM that prevents them from preferring the high WAC product over the low WAC product on their mainstream formularies. This will continue to be a developing area of interest for the industry, and other PBMs may have some difficult decisions ahead on whether they're going to follow this landmark case and make different decisions moving forward, or whether they'll continue to prefer the high WAC products. Thanks for joining us today as we broke down the topic of wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC. Hopefully you learned something throughout this episode. As always, if you found value in this episode, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our content. If you have any feedback on the content, we would love to hear from you. And if you have any consulting projects or training needs in your organization, we'd be happy to help you. Please reach out to us at www.thekoifarmer.com. Thanks for your time, and we hope to see you next time.
You're looking for the cure.